Welcome to the HKS Energy Policy Seminar. I'm Joe Aldi, and I'll serve as the host for our seminar here today. We're operating in this semester seminar in a hybrid format. I see we have every seat taken except for two, and it's always the front row. There's a few extra seats next to where some of the faculty might sit, but you can come join us up here if you'd like. We're also thrilled to have so many friends and colleagues and students and alumni joining us online. Thank you for joining us. I'm really thrilled that we have with us today Neil Chatterjee for his talk, The Energy Demand Era. Neil is the Chief Government Affairs Officer for Palmetto. Previously, he served as a former commissioner and chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Before his service in the executive branch, Neil served as a policy advisor for the Senate Republican leader, and before that as a policy advisor to a member of the House of Representatives. He is also a proud graduate of Henry Clay High School and the great Commonwealth of Kentucky. Neil, welcome to the Energy Policy Seminar.
Thank you so much. Now, is that where? Okay, perfect. Well, thank you all so much for having me. It's genuinely an honor to be here. First off, can everyone see me okay? This is kind of a high podium. I just want to make sure I'm a little bit diminutive in stature, but what an honor and experience to be here to speak today, to be introduced by a fellow Lexingtonian. Those of us who grew up in Lexington, Kentucky, we have always been enamored of academia. My parents were both professors at the University of Kentucky, so I've always had a deep sense of awe and admiration for academic institutions. I myself was never a potential candidate for Harvard, but my sister was, and she was actually recruited here back in 1998. She wound up going to Wellesley College, but we did visit Harvard as a family back in 98. And I recall during the tour, I had to go to the bathroom so badly. And I asked them at the law school library if I could use the restroom, and I was denied. So literally Harvard wouldn't let me pee. And here I am 27 years later giving a keynote address at the Kennedy School. So it's kind of an awesome life full circle moment. So really appreciate it and am humbled to be here today. So some of y'all may be wondering, what the FERC? Who is this guy and why are we here having lunch, listening to him speak? I am going to talk a little bit about the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, where I had the honor to serve as a commissioner and chair, why it's important and why you guys should care about it. And then talk a little bit further about where I think policy is going in this country and what role that you guys can play in it. And so I will start with some very simple basics. So the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is an independent agency within the U.S. government, which when at full complement has 5 members, no more of which than 3 can come from one political party. And the reason that is so important and so significant is that because the nature of FERC's work is so consequential, it is literally the principal reliability regulator for the U.S. grid, meaning that when you go and hit the switch and the lights come on, this very simple exercise that all of us take for granted, there is so much that goes into that simple task, and FERC is the agency that is responsible for making sure that that simple task is executed properly. It's also responsible for approving energy infrastructure projects, applications for things like natural gas pipelines and liquefied natural gas export facilities. It is responsible for setting rates, terms, and conditions for oil pipelines. It sets return on equity for electric transmission lines. In base terms, it is the country's most significant energy regulator. I have joked with both Secretary Rick Perry and Secretary Jennifer Granholm that I believe the Department of Energy is misnamed. I believe when you look at DOE's purview, it is principally oversight of the scientific labs and the nuclear fleet, and that FERC is in fact the country's most significant energy regulator. They both, in their folksy Michigan and Texas ways, roll their eyes at me and dismiss me. But the point is not understated that FERC plays this really, really critical role. Now, why did I take a moment to emphasize the fact that FERC is independent with a bipartisan configuration where you have individual members who serve staggered 5-year terms? The point of that is so that individual members can theoretically outserve the president that appointed them. And that is so important today when it comes to something like energy policy, because what we want, what we need, what we genuinely crave is stability. And I genuinely believe that FERC has been a beacon of stability in what is an otherwise volatile regulatory landscape. What do I mean by that? Look at US EPA, for example. EPA went one direction under the Obama administration, went a completely different direction under the first Trump administration, whipsawed back again under the Biden administration, and now has zigzagged even further under a second Trump administration. And when it comes to folks that have to make investments in energy and energy infrastructure, I have to tell you, it is absolutely maddening to try to peg those investment decisions to the political pendulum swinging so wildly back and forth. So FERC has been this beacon of stability over the past 2 decades. Did FERC go in a different direction under my leadership than my predecessors in the Obama administration? Absolutely. But it wasn't a dramatically different direction. Did FERC go in a different direction after I left with my successors in the Biden administration? For sure. But it wasn't a dramatically different direction. And this last 9 months of the second Trump administration, FERC has been led by a friend of mine who was a former colleague, similarly did not go in a dramatically different direction, because the decisions that the agency has to make on these critical issues, they genuinely touch every American, and we don't want politics to infect these kinds of decisions. But unfortunately, we have come to a place now where politics touches on everything. And that wasn't always the case. When I first came to Washington as a young aide in the early 2000s, the chairman and the ranking member of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, which is the principal committee in Congress with responsibility over energy policy, the chairman and the ranking member, one Republican, one Democrat, were both from New Mexico, Senators Domenici and Bingaman. And the irony of the situation is that during those early years of the George W. Bush administration, the Senate majority actually flipped and flopped back and forth quite a bit. Yet the agenda of the Senate Energy Committee never shifted, because at the end of the day, Senators Domenici and Bingaman weren't doing what was in the interest of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. They were doing what was in the interest of New Mexico, a state that they both represented, because we were in an era where senators tended to do what was in favor of what was above their heads or what was below their feet. And you had an era in which Republicans from my part of the country, Kentucky, had much more in common with Democrats in Appalachia than we did with Republicans in the Northeast. And you had Democrats in the West who had much more in common with Republicans in the Midwest than they did with Democrats in the Southeast. Something changed around the Obama era, particularly around efforts to tackle climate change. It's hard to believe today, but John McCain, the Republican nominee for president in 2008, was the principal author of a cap and trade bill designed to reduce carbon emissions in a market-based way. Mitt Romney, the Republican nominee for president in 2012, during the end of his tenure as a senator from Utah, was openly calling for a price on carbon to reduce emissions in the US to deal with climate change. There was a period in time when climate change was not political. It was a wonky technical issue that experts kind of, negotiated back and forth over. It was in the Obama years, and then Trump threw gasoline on it, literally and figuratively, that suddenly the energy policy discussion regarding climate change and decarbonization became very, very political. And to me, that is unfortunate, because the questions before us today, honestly, are not cleanly political. So for the past 20 years or so, America has had relatively flat demand for power. And in the interim, what has happened is, because we've been the beneficiaries of this flat demand for power, politicians, celebrities, entrepreneurs, they have all started making decisions that used to be made by engineers. Things around complex items like resource adequacy and reliability, suddenly politicians and celebrities are deciding what plants should be open, what plants should be closed, and what sources of generation should be deployed. I'm sorry. People ask me, like, Neil, this is such a complex conundrum. Like, how do we deal with the challenges of surging energy demand while maintaining reliability and affordability and decarbonizing in the face of climate threats? How do we possibly do this? And I tell them, and I don't say this to be joking or flippant or funny, it's a simple solution. Make energy policy boring again. When energy policy is boring and you allow the nerds to make the decisions, and I am speaking to a room full of nerds, and I am a nerd myself, you get positive outcomes without any of the complicated ancillary benefits. And this is so critical at this point in time, because we are no longer the beneficiaries of that 2 decades long era of flat demand. We are about to see, not just here in the US, but globally, an unprecedented surge in demand for electric power, driven by AI and data centers necessary to support AI, but also by things like streaming services, increased vehicle electrification, building electrification, a reshoring of manufacturing in this country, semiconductor manufacturing, crypto, Bitcoin mining. All of these things are incredibly energy intensive endeavors that are going to put huge strain on grid operators. And we've got to figure out, how do we meet this surge in demand while maintaining reliability and affordability, while simultaneously not backsliding on our decarbonization goals. Now, this may seem like an incredibly complex problem, but the reason I am optimistic about our ability to achieve it, because at the end of the day, it's a math problem. And you know who can solve math problems? Engineers. And that's who I want to re-empower so that we can navigate this complex circumstance. Because right now, the politicians who are making the decisions instead of the engineers, they're gumming the whole system up. We are stuck in this antiquated notion, this antiquated system where if you are for fossil fuels, you're of the political right, and if you're for clean energy and climate solutions, you're of the political left. And I think that is so damaging, and we've got to bust our way out of it. And I actually think that AI will be the thing that enables us to break out of our partisan corners. Because in order to win the AI race for national security purposes, and I want to be clear here, winning the AI race, I am convinced, is essential to national security. Warfare in the 21st century will not be fought by human beings, but by drones and AI. And we cannot allow an autocracy to control AI in the 21st century. But in order to win the AI race, we need a tremendous amount of electric power. It's interesting. Donald Trump, when he campaigned for president, made two promises to the American people when it came to energy. One was to win the AI race for national security purposes, and two was to bring down the cost of electricity to alleviate the inflationary burdens that a lot of Americans had been feeling. Well, those are seemingly antithetical goals, unless you're really smart about energy policy. So what does smart energy policy look like? To me, that means the political left has to recognize we cannot possibly win the AI race while maintaining reliability and affordability and reducing carbon emissions without fossil fuels. We are going to need fossil fuels, particularly natural gas, for the foreseeable future. So let's find ways to utilize technology like direct air capture and carbon capture and sequestration to mitigate the impacts of natural gas usage. Because let's be honest, natural gas is a really, really good fuel. It's affordable, it's abundant, it's much cleaner than other sources of energy, it's easy to transport. Its only negative consequence is that when you burn it, it generates carbon and methane emissions. So let's figure out how we can counteract those carbon and methane emissions and utilize the fuel to maintain reliability and affordability in the face of this surging demand. On the other side, on the political right, there has to be a recognition that we cannot possibly win the AI race while bringing down the cost of energy and maintaining reliability with fossil fuels alone. That we will need not just solar and storage and wind and geothermal and nuclear, we will also need negawatts. Things like demand response, energy efficiency, virtual power plants, distributed energy resources, grid enhancing technologies that better enable us to squeeze maximum efficiency from our existing infrastructure. These are all essential things. And I think if we get out of our partisan corners and recognize this is what it will take to win the AI race, we can start to take some of the politics out of energy and get us to a place where we can do the right things to win the AI race in a smart way. And look, I'm genuinely optimistic when you take a step back and look at the US grid and power markets, if you look at where the renewable capacity is, if you look at where the opportunities are, they're in red states, they're in rural communities. If you look at where the demand for power is, it's in blue states, it's in big cities. If we can actually figure out a way to piece this together, I think we can get to a place where red supply will feed blue demand, and we can actually take the politics out of all of this. But it's not easy. I'll be honest. If there was a easy solution, if there was a silver bullet, I would have done it as chairman of FERC. I couldn't, because I had to wrestle with these complex issues, because these really are truly, genuinely complex issues. It starts with infrastructure, with building, with permitting in this country. It is very, very difficult to build things in America. I have seen this firsthand. What's interesting when it comes to an energy perspective is that the historic opponents of building energy infrastructure, because it was largely fossil infrastructure, have now become the proponents of building transmission lines to get clean energy onto the grid. And I was screaming this from the rooftops during my waning days at FERC, that you could not tie up the permitting process for natural gas pipelines and liquefied natural gas export facilities in bureaucratic red tape and legal obstacles under the Natural Gas Act, and not expect those very same challenges to emerge under the Federal Power Act when it comes to build transmission lines. Because the reality is, Americans don't want energy infrastructure coming through their backyards, whether it's a natural gas pipeline or a clean energy transmission line. NIMBYism, not in my backyardism, is not political. It's not ideological. Americans don't want this kinds of infrastructure. So how do we solve these complex questions? I'll be honest, it's not easy. It's going to require some complicated choices and trade-offs. To me, the easiest way to build infrastructure in this country would be to utilize existing right-of-ways. Let's just build along the same pathways that we've already utilized to establish existing infrastructure. Seems simple, easy enough, right? There are real moral questions to that. You're going back to the same community that withstood the last round of infrastructure build out and asking to build through their backyards again. Now, as an academic exercise, and I realize I'm speaking in an academic institution, so that's what we're supposed to talk about. As an academic exercise, I think I could make a credible case to the community that, yes, I'm sorry, we're going to build through your yard again, but this time we're going to build a transmission line that will enable the build out of a cleaner source of generation, that will lead to the retirement of a higher polluting source of generation, that over the course of time will lead to cleaner air and cleaner water for your community. As an academic exercise, I think I could maybe sell that. As a real world exercise, it's very hard to go to that community, because they'll say, why aren't you going to the community next door? Because they can afford to lawyer up, because they can block us. Why are you coming through our yards again? These are really, really difficult questions. When I was chairman of FERC, this actually was very frustrating to me. I had colleagues at the state level who would say to me, Neil, we would love it if FERC would just overrule us, would roll over us and build this infrastructure, because otherwise it'll never get built. But I can't say that aloud or I'll be eviscerated in my community. And I was like, why are you putting this on me? I like to go on vacation. I might want to come to your town someday. Why do I have to be the bad guy? Why can't you make the tough decision? But it is a really hard decision to authorize building this kind of infrastructure through people's community. The siting part is hard. The harder one, in my view, is cost allocation. How do you figure out who pays for this stuff? So say you have state A that has a huge amount of renewable capacity, and you have state C that has huge demand for energy. Common sense, right? Build a huge transmission line, get that clean energy from state A down to state C. Easy. What happens to state B in the middle? Now, again, as an academic exercise, I think I can credibly make the case to ratepayers in state B that they will see a genuine benefit in the form of alleviated transmission congestion. It is a real benefit. To me, it's probably one of the most complicated things in our energy distribution system today. So ratepayers in state B will see a genuine benefit in the form of alleviated transmission congestion. So as an academic exercise, I think I could look ratepayers in state B in the face and say, please do this. As a real world exercise, going to these folks and saying, you will benefit from neither the generation nor the consumption of this power. We're going to build a transmission line through your backyard that you don't want, and we're going to ask you to pay for it. Really, really, really difficult to achieve, but it's necessary. We have to get it done. I actually think it is unfortunate that many of these critical issues are falling upon energy regulators. My former colleagues at FERC, state regulators, they should not be the sole people making these enormously consequential decisions. I think we need leadership from the Oval Office to governor's mansions to Congress to nonprofits to academic institutions to industry. We all need to collectively come together and recognize how important this is and that we have to get it right. It should not fall to my poor former colleagues at FERC. They are dealing with something right now which may seem like the most boring technical thing in the world, but it is so hard. It's called data center co-location. Raise your hands if you've heard anything about data center co-location. All right, there's a bunch. This is a good crowd, good crowd. So here is the conundrum before the commission right now. The quickest, easiest way to get power to support a data center to undergird AI is to go behind the meter and build out a data center directly in the footprint of existing generation. And in this instance, a lot of people are looking at nuclear plants. So seems like a no-brainer, right? You've got nuclear power, our single greatest form of carbon-free baseload generation. You're hooking up the data center for AI directly to the nuclear plant. We're not backsliding our decarbonization goals. Everybody wins, right? Here's the challenge. We're already seeing really high electricity prices in regions of the country. We have limited capacity. If you were to take even further capacity off the grid behind the meter, now you're suddenly spreading even higher costs amongst fewer ratepayers and exacerbating affordability challenges. That's a real question. That, to me, is the more solvable question because it's a math problem and it's a money problem. And the hyperscalers who are building these data centers, they have the resources, they can pay more and deal with the cost implications and spread that out. The more complex question is resource adequacy. What happens if FERC sets a precedent that all of these data centers can co-locate behind the meter and take this existing capacity off the grid? Well, if you have one or two, maybe it's manageable. Suddenly, let's say you have 50 data centers that are pursuing this type of co-location approach. Then you might have a genuine threat to resource adequacy. Right now, I live in the Northern Virginia suburbs in an area called Data Center Alley. We have huge data centers throughout the region. And I will tell you today, My neighbors and I love these data centers because they're making huge contributions to the tax base without adding any traffic. Because once these facilities are constructed, there aren't a whole bunch of people going to work there. You would not believe the soccer field that my 13-year-old daughter plays at. It's insane. The U.S. women's national team doesn't play at a facility as nice as this one in Loudoun County where my daughter plays because of the resources that are coming from these data centers. So today, my neighbors and I, we love this. This is amazing. Look at what we get to do and look what we get to avail. Look at our roads, our bridges, our schools, our parks. This is all incredible. Even if prices started to go up in the face of increasing data center demand, I even still think we would be okay with paying a little bit more because we're genuinely seeing the benefits from the tax contributions of these data centers. It's the 6 days of the year that I was most nervous about when I was chairman of FERC that get to be the problem. What happens on those 3 hottest days of summer when consumers need air conditioning? Or what happens on those 3 coldest days of winter when consumers need heat? I have to be honest with you. If grid operators are given a choice of sending power to a 24/7 data center necessary to support AI for national security purposes, or to residential consumers who need air conditioning or heat, it's going to that data center 100% of the time. Then suddenly, when I'm without air conditioning on the 3 hottest days of the summer, or without heat on the 3 hottest days of the winter, I'm looking a little bit less favorably at that really, really nice turf soccer field. I say all this to say none of this is easy, but there are opportunities, and I want you all to be optimistic. One of the reasons I like speaking at academic institutions is that you all are the future. You all are the folks who can genuinely make a difference in this space. So one of the things I'm going to say now to the students in the room, we have a huge situation in the country where we have a tremendous backlog in the interconnection queue. What is this? Raise your hands again. Who's familiar with interconnection queue? But tons of people. This is a very sophisticated room. So one of the challenges that we have right now is there are studies that are required to be completed before you can plug in generation onto the grid. It seems insane, but we have all of this stranded power that can't even get plugged in because we don't have human beings capable of doing the studies. So one ask I have of those of you who are students in the room, please don't go to Wall Street. Go and work for a boring RTO or ISO and do the interconnection studies because it's important for humanity. But I actually think this is an area where AI can play a role as well. I think we can utilize AI, building on some of the efficiencies that my former colleagues at FERC did, to better alleviate some of the congestion in these interconnection queues. There's other ways I think that AI will benefit society as well. While yes, on the one hand, it is going to require a tremendous amount of power, and we need to understand exactly how much power that is. I'll be totally honest with you. We have a deficiency in fully evaluating forward power demand. Right now, the rule of thumb is that a simple Chatterjee search takes about 10 times as much power as a simple Google search. That is with today's AI technology. But I'm told with advanced AI, it will be 1,000,000 times as much power. I need to understand what that actually means and what the trade-off is and whether or not we can even meet that demand. AI's got to figure out a way to become more efficient, to become more flexible. One of the challenges we have is that people in the AI world and people in the energy world, not only do we not understand each other's businesses, we don't even know each other. I, as an energy guy, need to learn a lot more about how AI works. And I think people in AI need to learn a lot more about how power generation, distribution, and consumption works. And that's where you all, as young students, academics, intellects, can help kind of deal with this, because we really don't have a handle on it. Clear example. There was an announcement earlier this year from China, from a entity called DeepSeek, that said they could do AI much more efficiently than we can in the US. And overnight, this simple press release from DeepSeek, which I'm cynical. In my view, I view that to be Chinese propaganda designed to disincentivize investment in AI in the US. That simple press release, if you look at the stocks of the publicly traded independent power producers in the US, they all plummeted dramatically because the growth in those stocks was all predicated on the idea that there'd be this huge surge in demand. All of a sudden, one press release from China caused us to completely recalculate our view on what the demand would be. We don't understand this stuff, and we got to get better at it. And that's going to require academic study, academic thought. Look, I'll be honest, we're in a tricky place right now. People don't want to work for the federal government, and I don't blame them. It's a scary time to be working with the federal government. We're seeing huge reductions in force. We're seeing changes. We're seeing people who, like, I work with some of the most brilliant people on earth at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and they're leaving the commission because of the uncertainty around their career stability and trajectory. I'm worried about the brain drain from them leaving. I am more worried that we won't be able to get young people to step into these roles. We are facing down a genuine demographic crisis in the energy space where experienced leadership is retiring. There isn't really a middle demographic. There's dummies like me, but there's not like a middle demographic that is handling this. And we don't have young people coming in to the space. And to conclude my remarks, one of the reasons I'm here is to encourage you all, please, this is so important for humanity, for the economy, for society writ large. Please go work in government, work in energy, work in this space. Thank you all for the opportunity today, and I'll open it to any questions.
Thank you, Neil. I'll get things started, and then we'll pass around the mic. You talked about your interest in making energy boring again, and in trying to get the politics out of this so we can make, in a sense, sort of the better technical decisions. Recently, we had on campus a current member of Congress who would say, I want to get the good ideas, don't filter it through the politics, I'll figure out the politics. So one thing it'd be interesting to hear from you, if there's one change to, say, the current authorities at FERC. A lot of what FERC operates on are pretty old, dated authorities. If there's one thing you could change right now that you think helps us advance on these three goals that you elaborated on of the reliability, the affordability, and the sustainability, or the environmental dimension of power, if there's one thing you could say, hey, this makes progress in the near term, if we could make this happen, this would be great, what would you identify?
It's hard because it would put future FERC chairs, FERC commissioners in a very uncomfortable position, but it's citing authority. It's giving FERC the ability to cite necessary infrastructure, whether that be a transmission line for clean energy or a natural gas pipeline to move gas, whether it's, advancing some of these alternative energy technologies. because people don't want this stuff in their backyard, it's painful, right? I've been in high school gymnasiums where people have been angry with me because I've been supportive of energy infrastructure projects that go through their yards. But the reality is, somebody's got to make those tough calls. Today, FERC has some authority, but not enough authority to do it. That would be, if I could wave a magic wand in Congress, give FERC that authority. But even then, it's still hard because I don't want to be that FERC chair that has to look people in a room and say, I'm going to build this thing through your backyard. These are just hard questions and there's no easy solutions.
Thanks. Let me open it up to questions from the audience.
Hi, Neil. Thanks for your talk. My name is Garrett Sanborn. I'm an MPP1. I'd like to get your thoughts on maybe some kind of pricing scheme that we could use to have consumers pay for their energy usage per search as a way to maybe throttle the demand, either an agreement like kind of like the companies do it themselves or legislation or regulation.
Look, so we sort of have that in the competitive wholesale power markets in the country. So that's what FERC, principally oversees with the RTOs and the ISOs. So you have different market structures in different parts of the country. You've got places where we're from, like the Commonwealth of Kentucky, where you have traditional vertically integrated utilities who provide power. They go to their state commissions. They get a reasonable rate of return on their proposals, and consumers are held captive to that. You have to pay that. And then you have the competitive wholesale power markets where theoretically consumers should have more influence, and that you could get the lowest cost generation in these forward capacity auctions bid in. Do I think our markets are perfect? Absolutely not. We constantly need to make iterative changes, particularly as new technologies come into the fold. But I'm a big believer in those markets. And I think ultimately, like when you think about like these devices in our pockets, if Americans can truly understand their energy consumption and could better control it, I think it would not just be, like useful. I think it would be kind of exciting, right? And so I grew up in Kentucky. I currently work for a residential rooftop solar company. I love this because to me, I'm no longer dependent on a big utility to determine my energy consumption, my energy future, my energy price. I can control it myself. And then when you start layering on the possibilities, so I can get solar panels on my roof, I can get a battery backup to back up that solar panel. I can get a heat pump to control my water. I can get an HVAC system to control my heating and cooling in the building. I can get an electric vehicle that I can plug into. And when I have surplus power, I can feed that power back onto the grid. To me, that's the future, and it's super exciting. Probably my proudest achievement at FERC was an order called FERC Order 2222. My daughter's birthday is literally February 2nd, so I named it after her. But what that order did was it removed barriers to entry for aggregated distributed energy resources so that they could compete and be compensated for all of their attributes, for energy, for capacity, for ancillary services. So here, to answer your question, you're talking about pricing. I'm talking about reverse pricing. I'm saying if I've got a single electric vehicle or rooftop solar installation, my ability to impact the grid is nil. But if through the power of aggregation, suddenly thousands upon thousands of consumers could feed power back onto the grid, now not only are you meeting demand, you're doing it at the point of demand, and you're impacting prices as well. I think these kinds of market-driven solutions are what will get us to, I believe, answering your question about pricing. We should not just be takers when it comes to energy prices. And right now, I'll be honest, we're takers. We just pay the bill that comes in the mail. That doesn't need to be the case. We can be far more proactive if we're innovative.
Hi, Neil. My name is Lashe. I'm one of these nerdy, boring engineering professors who teaches power system here at Harvard. So your remarks resonate very strongly with me. So, I also lead the Power and AI initiative here, which very much is centrally aligned with your thoughts. So the question that I have is centered around one of the core issues on the reliability assessment. So one of the core apparatus of evaluating the grid reliability comes from these decades-long metrics, such as 1 day in 10 years, or loss of load probability less than equal to a certain threshold, which arguably work reasonably well in the case of fossil fuel and demand must serve era, but works very, very not very well in this new world. Engineers have been pushing. The National Academy of Engineering released a report last year. They convened a workshop in DC and talked about how to think about probabilistic approaches, stochastic approaches, to rethink about the core apparatus that is so central to a lot of the conversation you have about how much to build, where to build, and so on and so forth. But things fall between the cracks. So I wonder, between FERC and NERC and ISO and the utility, how do you move the needle on that very central question on reliability assessment and reliability standards?
Yeah, fantastic question. And I do think it is an essential one. And so I think on both sides, on the one side, you're seeing, quite frankly, from this administration, a heavy emphasis on reliability, which I'm not opposed to. I do think we saw in the previous administration things like suppressed capacity prices that accelerated the retirement of certain fossil sources of generation that, in my view, contribute to reliability challenges today. So I don't want to underemphasize reliability, but at the same time, we've got to recognize the potential of innovative new technologies. And so I think there are ways that we can constructively go about it. To me, the biggest thing is what you were noting between FERC and NERC: measurements, just assuring that that generation shows up when it's supposed to. I think one of the challenges that we've seen, and this was evidenced in PJM during Winter Storm Elliott, is an imbalance between generation that was supposed to show up and then that failed to show up. I actually, for one, was uncomfortable that there was a settlement negotiation in the aftermath of Elliott, because I actually kind of liked PJM's construct to where if you showed up, you were paid a bonus, and if you failed to show up, you were assessed a penalty, and it's kind of a zero-sum game. Those sources of generation that didn't show up had to pay the penalty to those that did. So I didn't like the idea of a settlement, because in my view, that kind of undercut the notion around it. I think Chairman Mark Christie took a number of steps at like looking at this measurability and ensuring that we accurately accounted for what sources of generation were there and what kind of showed up. So to me, getting that measurement right is the key component. I think, again, back to sort of my core thesis of this whole thing, where politics is interfering with everything. You've got folks who are pushing for cleaner sources of energy, who are sort of disregarding intermittency, who are basically like, we'll innovate our way out of this, or we'll address intermittency when we have that N-1 event. We'll cross that bridge when we get there. I think that's irresponsible. But on the other side, I don't like these folks who are completely disregarding clean energy sources because of intermittency and saying firm power is the only way to go. I think we need firm power and we need intermittent resources. I think there's a way to assess reliability if we are kind of smart and sober-minded in how we go about it, if that makes sense. That would probably get me a C in your class, that answer.
Thanks so much. I'm in Maths and Public Administration student here as well in Professor Aldi's class. I just wanted to ask, for the RTOs and ISOs, do you feel like they're sufficiently motivated to make capital investments in infrastructure and new kind of smart technologies to kind of improve the grid? Or if not, what do you think would be necessary to be able to make them do that?
Yeah, look, I'd say if the RTOs and the ISOs, the markets were allowed to function properly, then the answer would be yes. But the reality is they're not, because of politics, because nobody likes high prices. And so politicians, FERC chairs, folks in both parties, myself included, have taken steps to impact capacity market prices that I think distort accurate price signals, which ruins the basic element of what you were asking about. Look, no one likes high electricity prices, but the reality is those high electricity prices are the build signal to lead to the investments that are necessary for that new generation that you were asking about. So in a properly functioning market, we would have to tolerate really high electricity prices to trigger that build signal so that people would make the requisite investment in those new forms of generation. Because look, power generation, they don't want to make those investments unless they're incentivized to do so, and that incentive is high prices. And both parties have taken steps against this. Look, one of the most controversial things I did during my tenure at FERC was something called a minimum offer price rule, because I'm overseeing PJM, which encompasses 13 states in the District of Columbia. You've got states ranging from New Jersey and Maryland to West Virginia and Kentucky, who have hugely different views when it comes to public policy and energy. And they were all taking steps to support their own preferred sources of generation within their states. Now, I'm a big believer in states' rights and that states ought to have the decision-making capacity regarding their energy future. But when you're in a multi-state market and state A's actions are inhibiting state D's resources from being dispatched, and state D may not support state A's public policy objectives, this was a conundrum that I had to address. I maybe didn't handle it perfectly, but I tried. My successors were concerned about prices, and so they put steps in, something so wonky and technical and nerdy, the professor would understand this, called a market seller offer cap. Didn't seem like that controversial thing. You hear it and you're like, that's pretty innocuous. Who wouldn't want a market seller offer cap? Well, I think that artificially compressed capacity prices, so you didn't get that accurate price signal. So we didn't get the build signal that was necessary, and now we're so short capacity today. So a pure market would be best, but I'll be honest, these aren't pure markets. They're algorithms, layered upon algorithms, layered upon algorithms. That said, while these markets are not perfect, one of the coolest things that I did when I was chair at FERC, when I took my seat at a domestic energy market regulator, I didn't think there would be any international component to my role whatsoever. I got to travel the world and meet with our allies to teach them about markets. Because at the end of the day, our grid here in the US, while it has its many failings, it is the envy of the world. I signed multiple memorandums of understandings with our allies ranging from South America to Asia, because they wanted to not buy a commodity for us or have a commodity sold to us. They wanted to learn from our experience, from FERC's experience overseeing these markets, to see how can we build out our grid in a way that maintains the reliability and affordability that you all in America have been able to benefit from. And, oh, by the way, we're squeezing carbon out of the US power sector because of our market design. And so I wanted to take an extra moment to emphasize that, because I think too often we're too hypercritical in the US. We criticize ourselves too much. Can we do things better? Absolutely. Is our grid the envy of the world? Very much so.
So as you're saying that, Neil, I was reflecting on what I know about power markets and what I've learned about power markets. I've learned from Professor Hogan and the Harvard Electricity Policy Group over the years. So I actually would love for you, Bill, to chime in here on this point.
This is gonna be too hard. I can't. I'm not.
Thank you for an excellent talk, and it really was terrific, and there are just too many issues to address across the board. I want to ask you one question about your daughter's rulemaking and the virtual power plant idea. And I think conceptually, it works pretty well if you think about the whole organized wholesale markets that you're talking about, where the real-time pricing and all these kinds of things give them the right signals. It's quite another matter on the distribution system where most of the facilities that you're talking about are actually going to be connected, electric cars and so forth, and balancing all of these things where they don't have sensible pricing, and it's not under your current authority as FERC to set those prices or the rules or the structure for those markets. That seems to me to be a huge problem. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, look, this was tough. And I really appreciate, I'm gonna take a moment, not just the question, but your leadership on these complex issues over many number of years, including during my tenure at FERC. And when I first came, I'm gonna give it. I've got till my flight at 7, so I don't want to bug anybody. But so I actually think this is really, really interesting. So when I was first nominated to the commission, I was Mitch McConnell's coal guy, right? Like everyone, that was like kind of my reputation. And as I was going through the Senate confirmation process, Senator Ed Markey of Massachusetts here, along with Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island, they held up my nomination. They knew me and they liked me. They saw me as a staffer who worked long hours for little pay, and they thought that I was genuine. But they just wanted to talk to me. They said, "Hey, look, the commission has started looking at removing barriers to entry to energy storage resources and aggregated distributed energy resources. We don't want you to commit one way or the other to take action. Just take a look at it. We understand you're going to be under pressure to go into the commission and approve a bunch of natural gas pipelines. Just take a look at this energy storage and DER rulemaking." And I was honest. And so I made a commitment to the senators and they lifted their holds on my nomination. I got confirmed to the commission. And when I got in and I started looking at these rulemakings, I was like, man, there's really something here. Like this is potentially innovative, but God, there are these complex questions around jurisdiction, around, these behind the meter challenges, about this conflict between wholesale and retail. And so what I wound up doing was I broke the two orders up. I did 841 around energy storage because it was ready to go. And 2222, there were still some more questions that needed to be answered. And the utilities across the board, EEI, NRECA, APPA, they all sued me on 841. But the DC Circuit upheld us. And that gave us the confidence then when we move forward with 2222 that we felt that we were on strong legal footing. Because, yeah, I myself had some of the reservations that you had about, like, am I overstepping into retail jurisdiction? Is this really state dominion? And NARUC had some questions about it. But one of the cool things about breaking the two rules up, because FERC is a quasi-judicial body. It's not legislative. So we have to abide by the record before us. We built the record in 841, and we actually got to listen to some of the concerns that, say, rural electric cooperatives in the Southeast who were nervous about being overwhelmed by 2222's implications behind the meter. We were able to factor that into the record, into what our final rule was. Now, I've given this brilliant senatorial soliloquy, but to answer your core question. Here we are. I passed this thing in September of 2020. We're in almost October of 2025. We've seen very little progress, unfortunately. And I think part of that is because this is complicated. We've seen resistance from the states. We've seen resistance from the RTOs and the ISOs, but it's really the state resistance that I think has been most frustrating to me. I was, quite frankly, disappointed in my successors in the Biden administration. I would have thought this was a low-hanging fruit, and they would have built upon this and maybe passed 2222B, which is something that I was supportive of, which would have accelerated the process and addressed some of these questions, but it hasn't happened. And now we're dealing with an administration that is talking about sunsetting all regulations and revisiting them. I'm worried about the fate of 2222, period. And so this is my long-winded senatorial way of answering your very simple question, which is to say that sometimes this stuff is hard and you got to make tough calls. And I made a tough call. And in the process, I pissed a lot of people off. I got fired as chairman of FERC for it. I made a lot of enemies amongst state commissioners who did feel that I was overstepping into their jurisdiction. But I felt like it was the right thing to do. And I had a moment in time and I took my shot. But I'm also self-aware enough to know 5 years out, it hasn't worked, unfortunately. But I've appreciated your intellect and advocacy on it. You gave me a fighting shot.
Other questions?
Hello. Excuse me. I'm Zihua from Chinese School of Public Health. So my question is that U.S. has not yet rolled out a single nuclear plant in last 3 decades, and many of them are reaching the end of lifespan now. So what's the outlook of nuclear plants in the U.S.?
Well, we did have one new one. It was $27 billion and 9 years past the date. Look, nuclear's tough. I'm a huge proponent of nuclear power. As I stated earlier, it's our single greatest form of carbon-free baseload generation. I would love to see nuclear power deployed in this country. There have been a lot of really exciting press releases over the last year, some of which I have been a part of. I'm an industry advisor to KKR. We made a significant announcement of a $50 billion commitment with Energy Capital Partners to deploy nuclear resources and new resources to meet the surge in demand for AI. I want to believe it so bad. Until I actually see a deal happen, I don't believe it. If you actually take a step back and look at all these press releases over the past year, they're not take or pay deals. They're not, direct contracts. They're basically announcements like, hey, if you can prove this technology to be scalable, then we will be here with the financing capital when you're ready. I just think nuclear is too expensive. At the end of the day, it's still a nuclear weapon that has to be guarded 24/7. There are huge costs associated with it. When combined with cheaper forms of energy, it's just not cost competitive. This was one of the things I spoke earlier about, this minimum offer price rule thing that I had to wrestle with when I was at FERC. Really what drove that controversy was state level subsidies for nuclear plants, because these plants were otherwise under earning. Now, this surge in demand being driven by AI and other things is giving an economic lifeline to new nuclear plants. To existing nuclear plants, but to building new ones, there's a desire to do so, particularly to meet the AI demand. I think it's gonna take, I just don't see it happening with private capital alone. I think it's gonna take public investment. So the US taxpayer has to agree that winning the AI race and not backsliding on decarbonization will require nuclear power, and therefore we will be willing to invest taxpayer dollars in doing so. I just don't think the math pencils out for private capital right now when it comes to nuclear. Solar storage with gas peakers, so much easier to deploy and so much cheaper. If I were advising private capital, I have a hard time pushing them towards nuclear energy, despite the fact that I care about it from a decarbonization perspective. From an economic perspective, it's very tough.
Hi, Neil. Thank you for your time today. I wanted to ask you about something you mentioned, which is the politicization of energy today. Before coming to the Kennedy School, I was actually at the Department of Energy's Loan Programs Office. And a lot of the projects we were working on, which I see as very important to this surge in demand for energy from AI, a lot of them were stopped. And so my question for you is, how do we make this less political, especially when the urgency is like there's so much urgency for energy quickly, and it's not just. I think we need firm power, and it's a combination of clean and, for example, natural gas. So how do we convey the importance of meeting somewhere in the middle?
This is such a silly answer, but it's so relevant. So Jigar Shah is a really good friend of mine, and this is so dumb. It's not the answer, but he and I do panels together all the time. And people actually love to see that because I was a Republican appointee, he was a Democrat appointee, and I respect the work that he did at DOE. He respects the work that I did when I was a Republican chair at FERC. And we go to these conferences where, quite frankly, the audience is a lot of investors, and we give our respective perspectives, and they like hearing from both of us because it gives them kind of clarity in where to place their bets, and it takes some of the politics out of it, right? So he speaks from his experience in the Biden administration. I speak from my experience in the Trump administration. And these investors who are trying to figure out what is up and what is down, that's just that's the one way that I have found to make it work, is just to find an ally in Jigar who we see the world similarly. And when we express it from our differentiating political perspectives, we can kind of penetrate a little bit. I wish I had a smarter, easier answer, because it is insane to think that you had businesses who made investment decisions based on what they thought was the law of the land and funding that was coming out of the LPO that are now seeing these funds rescinded. To me, it's short-sighted. And when you don't have that kind of certainty, long-term, it hurts everybody. And that's the message that Jigar and I are trying to share with people, is that sometimes Democrats will be in power, sometimes Republicans will be in power. If you constantly have the pendulum swinging back and forth, and you can't rely on decisions that prior governments made in the future, if you lose that trust in government, it actually really harms investment. And if that message can break through, I think it will help with the politics.
Hi, thank you for coming. I'm a joint student with MBP and MBA over at HBS, and I spent the last 2 years doing utility scale solar development around the US. One of the major issues is the RTOs and ISOs, and just how long it takes to kind of get through those with the interconnection, etc. Do you have any thoughts, apart from just the people side of things, about how are we going to get over that, given how different it is in every single ICO and RTO, and it just takes years and years and years? So yeah, just any thoughts on that would be great.
Yeah, great question. FERC did what they could with Order 2023, where they tried to create some kind of greater efficiencies in the process to enable solar and storage to apply together rather than individually, to try and reduce some of the timelines for the requisite studies that are required to get through the queue process, to sort of eliminate speculative projects. Because I think what a lot of times happens is because of the backlog in these queues, you have parties that they take a queue spot and then try and raise capital, but they're not necessarily like a real project. Those are all nice steps. I think even Chairman Phillips, who authored the rule, would tell you it's not a silver bullet. I'd love to see further action, kind of from Congress on it. I don't mean to be flippant about the human resources piece to it. We really do need more human beings to do this work. I am optimistic that AI could contribute to it, but I also think we need more reforms. I would love to see it, quite frankly, come from Congress. And there has been some thought from big utility scale providers. They have kicked around the idea of doing a sort of second round via congressional legislation. Because I think what's hard for FERC is when you do an order like 2023, it applies to all the RTOs and the ISOs. And there's not like in my view, a one size fits all solution. I think some of the challenges in PJM are very different than SPP, are very different than MISO. So for FERC to go region by region at 206, everybody is like really onerous and complicated. For FERC to do a big overall rulemaking is difficult to implement. I think this is one of those areas I'd love to see Congress step in and as a component of some kind of federal legislative permitting reform, they address queue reform, because it is actually insane that we have all of this utility scale generation that's just unable to plug in. Where the politics get complicated, this administration's been pretty open that they don't like utility scale wind in particular, but they don't like utility scale solar either. So I'm just not optimistic it's going to happen anytime in the next 3.5 years, which is why I'm on the resi side.
So before we wrap up, let me note that we'll meet again at noon Monday of next week in this room. We're pleased to host Elaine Buckberg, a senior fellow at the Slot Institute and former chief economist of General Motors. Elaine will speak on the uncomfortable truths of public EV charging. Finally, please join me in thanking Neil Chatterjee for his remarks today. Thank you, Neil. That's great.